Welcome back, WW Fly Corvair. Today I'm going to give you Parasol structures part number 2. Here we're going to cover a couple of special cases and a few details about front cabanes. We're going to do this in pictures. I apologize in advance for some of the poor quality of pictures here. I screenshotted them off the internet. Let's not get focused on the quality of the pictures. We're not planning on building anything from these. What I do want you to do is take a look at them. You can look at other pictures of these on the net after this, and you'll have a better understanding of what's going on structurally on these particular parasols. The first one we're going to take a look at here in the black and white photograph is a Fairchild 22. This is a factory engineered parasol. It's a derivative of a Fairchild 24. 22s were kind of a rare airplane. This particular one radial powered, but they also came with Ranger engines. But the focus here is a special case of parasols where it clearly has V'd cabanes or V'd lift struts, but has something different going on with the cabanes that makes that possible. Take a look at the splay outward of the cabanes on this airplane. They're leaned outward about 35 degrees. And they're very heavily built, and they're integrated into the fuselage structure. This type of splayed outward allows it to resist the twisting motion that we talked about in part number 1. This is not the same thing structurally. If you took those cabanes and made them vertical, they would not have the same ability to resist the rotation between the wing and the fuselage. And we'll take a look at some of the other photographs of other airplanes that have this same condition. Let's move down to next picture here. Next picture is sort of a rare home built. This is called Peking Deuce. It's been around since the 60s, and it was initially, it is not related to a Peyton pole. It is a different airplane entirely. A guy named Jerry Peking designed this, and this appeared in Bauer's 25 Most Practical Home-Built Airplanes. I actually have personal experience with one of these. There was one at Spruce Creek owned by a real good friend of mine, and I saw it in about this stage of covering. Now let's take a look. It also has splayed lift struts. A Peking Deuce has V'd lift struts also, but the resistance to rotation between the wing and the fuselage is provided by the outward splay. Now also take a look at that. Those are all welded up. Those cabanes, the diagonals in the front are very heavily built, and these are welded onto the fuselage. This is not the same type of structure that your Peyton pole project does. This is built on a different scale. If you take a look at this fairly old school airplane, one of the comments that people made about it was that it had the fuselage structure of a Great Lakes biplane with the wing structure of a Heath Parasol, suggesting that it was structurally imbalanced. Jerry Peking was a Boeing engineer, and airplane has a pretty good track record, but it is sort of an odd mixture of scale of stuff. It has fairly thin wing spars and has a fuselage structure that I would be comfortable with 300 horsepower on. So, but the main thing we're focused on is it did have V'd lift struts, but again, it's got the big splay in the center section. This photograph doesn't really show it real well, but it has significant splay, and it also has very heavy wiring on it. Let's move to taking a look at the next airplane. Okay, this isn't a Parasol at all. This is obviously a Fokker D7 from World War I vintage. But what I want to share with you about this is, although this is a biplane and it does have end struts on it, the end struts are not structural on this airplane. This airplane has two independent, entirely separate cantilever wings on it. It does not have flying wires. You could take the lower wing off this airplane, and if you could bring it into weight and balance, it would fly just perfectly with the lower wing missing. Biplanes normally do not do this. They count on the interaction structurally between both wings to form a serious structure. But you take a look at this, you could imagine this as a parasol. What I want to show you is the type of structure it takes to resist the twisting. Let's look at this next photograph. The green tubing structure that you see here is a Fokker D7. The green structure, if you look at it, shows the tubing as it relates to holding the upper wing on. To resist the twisting action, notice how much splay is in it, and also notice that they form a tripod arrangement to the front spar attach. The tripod arrangement, all the legs of it are not in the same plane, and that provides an enormous amount of resistance to twisting on it. This does not even show the rear fitting in place yet, but this stuff is really heavily built, and the splay, again, is very, very different structurally. It's a biplane, but it's structurally related to a Parasol, and to have it work at all, it has splay outward in it. Next photograph right here, Stolp Starlet. Back to Parasols. This does have V'd lift struts, and this is a good look at how much splay has to be in the cabanes. And the next photograph I'm going to show you is also a Stolp, and I'm going to show you how heavily this stuff has to be built to resist twisting if you don't have the parallel lift struts and cross brace wires of a standard Peyton pole. You can take a look at this and I'll show you a couple of details. But a Stolp Starlet was, again, a 1970 home built, designed by Lou Stolp, who was a real famous biplane designer and a real good engineer. We're going to take a look at the next photograph here, was actually taken in my hangar. This is Justin Peters' Corvair-powered Starlet. If you can take a look at the structure here and see how much splay is in this, and that's the splay that allows it to function with V'd lift struts. If you made these cabanes vertical, you could not brace it well enough to use V'd lift struts. Also, of note on this, when you take a look at it, look real close and see that to the center of the airplane, it has elements that come towards the middle of the firewall on this, again forming a tripod-like structure to the front spar attach point, where it's not all in one plane. Again, these are features where if you look at your cabane, you have your two cabane struts. If you look at your Peyton pole, you have two cabane struts and a diagonal cabane on each side. In that arrangement, they're really all in one plane. And if you take a look at this Stolp in my hangar here, they are not in one plane, and that's what forms the tripod and gives it resistance to rotation. So when we look at V'd lift struts on Parasols, they will always appear on an airplane that has very heavily built cabanes that have an outward slope to them. Now, in a Peyton pole, somebody having a center section that's 30, 32, 36 inches wide, that's not going to do it. By comparison, you'd be talking about a 48-inch wide center section. And also, there's a question of how well you can attach a cabane structure. It works real well to go directly down vertically into the wood, but these type of angular loads, the fittings on a Peyton pole, where the fittings are attaching the cabane to the upper longerons, they're not really inclined to work that way. They're not designed around that. They're designed for straight up and down loads. So you can't just widen the center section at random without giving some thought to what the fitting looks like, because when you widen the center section, you are putting a significant load side to side on the top of the fuselage. Again, that's a design parameter, and you're not going to look at that if you're building basically a straight Peyton pole. And again, all of this is external, because if you have parallel lift struts and crossed wires on your airplane, like the plans show, none of this stuff applies to your airplane. I just want to include this in case somebody comes back later and saying, oh, I saw one of these airplanes and it worked on something else. Well, there's something else going on, and you got to have the details. This red airplane right here, shown in the next photograph, this is a Davis. One of the guys who was writing in on the discussion is Steve Culp, and I believe he owns one of these. And if you take a look at this airplane, it again has heavily splayed outward cabanes to it. This also has a very unique wing structure where it's a double tapered wing, and again, sort of a different animal than what we're used to. And if you look at the cabanes to the rear of this, the cabanes to the rear are a V'd cabane. So different animal, not everything meets the eye. So if someone was dismissive of the first video because they said, oh, I can think of an airplane that has V'd lift struts, they're glossing over, or they don't really understand the relationship between V'd lift struts and the nature of the cabanes. Again, a Davis, beautiful airplane, really well engineered, but an antique and a classic that you can't directly alter a Pete and pole to look like just because you like the V'd lift struts. I'm kind of partial to V'd lift struts on Parasol. All of these are really good looking airplanes, but a Pete and pole is a good looking airplane in its own right when it's following the plans and really well done. The next element I want to get to is a little bit back to the plans of the Pete and pole. I want to take a look at something to show people back on the diagonal cabanes. Next photograph here I took about 2005. This is at Pioneer Airport, and this is the Pete and pole hangar at the grounds at EAA Oshkosh, where the airplane here is on display. This is the same airplane from the weight and balance drawing. This is the first purpose-built long fuselage Corvair-powered airplane. This is from the late 60s, and this is Bernard's handiwork in action. If you take a look at this airplane, one of the important things to notice about it is it has no diagonal cabanes. It has crossed wires in between the cabanes. Now, this severely restricts the use of the front cockpit. And I haven't really seen this type of stuff. The very original plans have crossed wires on one side, but no diagonals in the front, and that's obviously a no-no. But here, I think he was just putting a test bed together. I don't know how much people flew in the front cockpit, but this is the airplane that he established the weight and balance form that I refer to as the Holy Grail document. But this airplane's on display, and when you go to Oshkosh, you're shortchanging yourself not to make a trip over to Pioneer Airport and take a look at it in person. But again, notice no diagonal cabanes on this baby. Let's go take a look at the next airplane. This is the last original. Grace took this photograph in 2005 above Broadhead. That's the late Bill Knight flying the airplane when it was under his stewardship. We have to take a look at this, and a lot of people like the old-timey Model A stuff, and I do too. But let's consider that this is the last airplane of all of them built by the man himself. So you're looking at the complete evolution of what he thought was valuable. This is the airplane that I believe comes in sequence right after the one that's at Pioneer Airport. So here's the evolution of the design. You can't argue that this is not an original Pete and pole because this is the work of the guy himself. Now take a look. This is an air-to-air photograph from Tom Brown's Corvair-powered Pete and pole to the last original there. Obviously, it has diagonal cabanes, and they are way bigger than a half-inch 035 piece of tubing. So here, it has its parallel lift struts, obviously, as we want everybody to use. It does have jury struts on it, but there is no spacer between the two, and that's probably, might do that a little differently. But let's take a look at that it has very stout diagonal cabanes on it. Let's move to the next photograph and take a look. Here's Tom Brown and Grace, Broadhead 2006. Again, the last original. We want to take a look at this. A lot of stuff to study on this airplane. I did a weight and balance on it. It's incredibly light. I believe the airplane today is in the hands of Forrest Loverly. But let's take a look at the diagonal cabanes on this airplane. Diagonal cabanes, it's a little hard to tell in the photograph, but they are actually larger in size than the vertical cabanes. I spent a lot of time going over this airplane in great detail, and they are permanently affixed to the front vertical cabanes. This is much heavier built than most plans built Peyton poles. This is the ultimate evolution of what the man wanted. So it's really hard for anybody to debate, no, that wasn't really a good idea. If you really want to study the mindset and the ideas, you're not going to limit yourself to what Bernard was thinking when he was in his 20s in the early pre-war period. Why don't you want to know what the guy learned by the time he was in his 70s? So I study this, and that is the type of cabane diagonal in the front, and there's good reason for this. So if you catch somebody saying, oh, half-inch 035 would be fine, it's built to the plans, it's built to older plans. I look at the last original as a living, breathing, flying, most current set of plans. I knew Bill Knight not as well as other guys. I was not quite that fortunate, but I was pretty good terms with him. And I believe that you could make an argument that Tom Brown was as close as people got to Bill Knight. And knowing both of those guys, they put a lot of care into making sure that this airplane stayed original. There's almost nothing on this airplane altered from how Bernard had it. So when you study photographs of the last original, or if you have a chance to see it in person, hopefully someday, you are looking at the mind's eye of the man himself. So keep that in mind during discussions. And when you're planning on building your diagonal cabanes, take a good look at this photograph again and come up with some rational reason why your airplane's not going to look like this. You can think about it a long time, and I don't think you're going to come up with anything that would qualify as rational. Again, thanks for spending some time here. If you like this type of video, please remember to subscribe, and we'll see you out on the flight line. Thanks very much.